Thank you all for coming for tonight's event and joining the conversation on understanding the climate impact on Pacific Northwest waters and connecting climate change to local water realities. My name is Jackie Chen Xu, and I'm a water resource engineer and a climate scientist. And my research focused on seasonal water availability, drought forecasting, and how climate information can better support water management and agricultural decisions. It is my pleasure to moderate tonight's conversation and to co-host this event with Chris Wilke from the Center of Environmental Law and Policy as a part of the Pacific Northwest Climate Week event. We are grateful to the Ballard branch of the Seattle Public Library for providing this space, and we would also like to thank PNW Climate Week organizers, our volunteers, and our speakers, who I will introduce before each of their presentations later. But last but not least, I would like to thank every one of you for to help make tonight's gathering possible. And so most of all, thanks to each of you being here. To begin, I would like to show a short video, about a minute and a half, that offers a snapshot of drought, heat, and snowpack conditions across the western United States. The report begins with a striking contrast. Some parts of the Midwest had recently received enough precipitation to improve drought conditions, while much of the West continued to experience persistent or worsening drought. It also highlights two issues that are especially relevant to our discussion tonight: unusually early heat and mountain snowpack was well below normal in parts of the West, including the Pacific Northwest. So this video is not intended to provide the full explanation, but it is a snapshot from mid-April when statewide drought conditions were declared in Washington state. And conditions differ greatly from one watershed and community to another. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But it raises the central questions for tonight. What happens when heat, low snowpack, and long-term changes in the water cycle begin to reshape the places and systems that depend on reliable water? So let's take a look.
Snowpack readings reveal this past winter has been low on snow and high on persistent or expanding drought across the west and southern plains. As of this week, U.S. drought monitor data reveals over 50% of the country is in a moderate or worse drought. Precipitation across the Midwest has alleviated some of the problem across the Corn Belt from Iowa through Ohio. However, conditions continue to get worse in the West.
The heat out west has truly just been ridiculous. I'm based here in Fort Collins, and we set a new monthly March record by 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So our previous was 81 degrees. We hit 91. Previous to that, we hadn't seen a 90-degree day until May.
Mountain snowpack conditions remain well below normal despite this week's precipitation across higher elevations. Currently, the snowpack in the Pacific Northwest is 50% below normal. The Southwest and Southern Plains are in the grip of a 6-year-old drought.
Really, March has just made the story so much worse. The heat that we saw in March, particularly in the western U.S., was very unprecedented and honestly bordering on edge of what I think scientists would even think would be possible at this time of year. Truly, that has just fully changed the situation.
For Market to Market, I'm David Miller.
It's very heartbreaking. It's such an urgent thing that we need to start working on it. We heard about the record-breaking heat, the below normal mountain snowpack, and drought that has persisted for years in parts of the West. But the most important message is not simply one season was hot or that one snowpack measurement was low. The deeper issue is that warming changes how water moves through our landscape. And in the Pacific Northwest specifically, snowpack has historically functioned as a natural reservoir. It stores winter precipitation in the mountains and releases it gradually during the spring and summer, when farms, cities, rivers, salmon, and ecosystems really need it most. When more winter precipitation falls as rain rather than snow, when snow melts earlier, or when extreme heat accelerates water loss from soils, plants, and reservoirs, we may still receive precipitation, but not necessarily in the form, place, or season when it is most useful. That distinction matters. A region can experience heavy rain and still face summer water shortages. It can experience drought and flooding within the same year, and the effects are rarely distributed equally. Tonight's event is therefore not only about whether the Pacific Northwest will become wetter or drier. It is about how the entire water cycle is changing and what those changes mean for drinking water, agriculture, river flows, water quality, salmon, public health, wildfire risk, and communities throughout our region. It's also important to say that tonight is not only about understanding the risk. It is about exploring how communities, scientists, and advocates and policymakers can work together toward a more equitable and climate-resilient water future. To do that, we have organized the evening around three essential and complementary perspectives. First, science. What is changing? Why is it changing? And what can we reasonably expect? Second, community experience. How are these changes already affecting people? And what does equitable resilience look like on the ground? Third, policy response. How can laws, institutions, organizations, and individuals help protect water and prepare for the future? Each of our speakers will have approximately 20 minutes in respective time. We are reserving the audience questions as a part of the panel conversation with all three speakers at the end. And so the video that we just saw gave us a broad view of conditions across the West. Our first speaker will help us understand what lies behind those images and statistics and what they mean specifically for the Pacific Northwest. Dr. Guillaume Mauger is a state climatologist with the University of Washington Climate Impact Group. His work focuses on translating climate science into information that communities, agencies, and decision makers can use. His expertise includes regional climate change, water supply, flooding, sea level rise, and climate resilient planning. Tonight, Guillaume will help us examine how rising temperatures, changing precipitation, declining snowpack, and natural climate variability, including the developing La Niña, interact to influence timing and availability of water across our region. He will also help us move beyond a single headline or seasonal statistic to understand the larger patterns shaping the Pacific Northwest water. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Guillaume Mauger.
My name's Guillaume Mauger. I work at UW. I'm staying in UW because I'm at the State Climate Office, which sounds like a state agency, but actually is in the Climate Impacts Group at UW, for a research group that works on climate and also how to prepare for the effects of climate. So a little bit less sort of the more, I would say, difficult and high-level research, and more the applied, what do you do about it? What do you need to know to do something about it? And I've got to say one thing about the office, because I really think it's cool work. It's not the only work that's important in this space, I should say first, but this is what we do. We're really focused on helping people use climate science in a practical scenario. So we do a mixture of communications research and training around that. And there's four of us. I didn't include the pictures of everyone, but I do have a last slide if anybody wants to get there. All right, so as Jackie was saying, I'm going to sort of give the scientific basis, and then I think we're going to go on to say, the way that I think about it, we're going to go on to talk about the important things, which is what Paulina and Chris are going to talk about. So I'm just sort of giving you the background, so then we have like the motivation and the basis for talking about those. And I'm going to start with the most boring thing about climate change, most boring statistic in my opinion about climate change, which is annual average temperature. Because it has no meaning or value, you know, in terms of how it affects us, right? But it's the most reliable indicator of warming, right? And this is one graph, and there's a million different ones. Two things I want to point out. One, the observations. This is Washington State. Sorry. So this is the measurement, the orange line, that it's going up. And then then the shaded lines are sort of the range and the change in temperature for two different scenarios that are dependent on how much we emit in the future, right? So an optimistic one that's lower and a pessimistic higher. We don't need to go into a lot of detail here. The point is, one, we've seen some warming. The number that I can give you for our stage is around 1.5 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the last century and change, right? The projections, I want to point out two things about it. One, it doesn't matter what you're assuming about greenhouse gas emissions in the future if all you care about is up to about 2050. Both of them are kind of about the same amount of warming up to the mid-century, right? So it does matter at the end of the century, right? Pessimistic is more warming, optimistic less warming. The reason it doesn't matter in the meantime is even if you could magically turn off greenhouse gas emissions, we'd still have warming. There's basically more warming still in the pipeline. And so what we do in the future is going to have small effects on it, but the main thing is we're just catching up with what we've already done, right? So in the near term, it doesn't, it's really important in the long term. Like one thing I should say, right? We work on how do you prepare for the effects of climate, right? And that's distinct from how do you reduce the effects in the sense of reducing greenhouse gas. That's really important, not my expertise. They sort of work hand in hand, right? Like there's no either or here, right? They're both really important. Even if, like I said, even if we magically turn off emissions, we still have impacts that are happening. And just to illustrate that, I said 1.5 to 2 degrees warming, Fahrenheit warming since the beginning of 1900. The amount of time it's going to take to get again that same amount of warming, basically double what we've seen so far, is like 3 to 4 decades, right? So by mid-century, from now to mid-century, we're going to see about the same amount of warming as we've seen in the last century and a half, right? So it's accelerating. And that's also in that time frame, right, where it doesn't matter so much what we're assuming about our future. It's still important to think, we want to go the optimistic route, but in the next couple of decades, we're sort of living with what we got. Okay, so that's the main thing to take away there is like it's accelerating, right? In the near term, we've sort of got to deal with it. And then I could stop with this point that I'm making here, and you almost don't even need to look at the slide. This is the most important thing for you to take away from what I'm saying is that in our region, and today's nice topic is all about snowpack, right? Snowpack is sort of the canary in the coal mine for our region. And this drawing kind of illustrates why we see an effect, right? I mean, the freezing, water's always going to freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It's going to be harder to get down to that, right? And really, when you think about it, it's kind of a real estate effect or an area, right? Like as mountains are pointing on top, right? So as the snow line rises, there's less and less area that is seeing snowpack, right? So put some numbers on it. Studies range in terms of what they find, but what they find in broad strokes is that for the state of Washington, when we have our peak in snowpack in the spring, today we have about 15 to 30% less water in snowpack than we had in 1960. So if you think about that in terms of like what's coming out of our tap, right? We're already using basically all that we have. There's often not enough for everyone, like the Yakima County, they're seeing water shortages. There's often not enough in the streams for fish. So if you talk about a situation where your surplus is 0 or less, right, and you lose 15 to 30% of that, we're already in a place where we're dealing with shortages. So that's the past. The projections say 50 to roughly middle range of projections, another 50% loss by the end of the century. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head for that middle ground I was telling you about, like with the temperature change, but big changes, right? This is the canary in the coal mine. Okay, so this matters for the amount of water we have available in summer that was referencing, like water in streams, water in taps, so forth, but it also matters for flooding. And that's actually why I mentioned that real estate effect. None of this is private property in most cases, right? But basically when we have a big storm come in winter, there's a snow line, and above that, we're seeing snowfall, below that rain, right? As that snow line goes up, we're going to get much more rain with those same events and less snow. So even if storms weren't changing at all, and we were going to get the exact same amount of precipitation from them, we would be getting bigger floods, right? And so there's that flooding effect, right? More rain, less snow means bigger floods. That's the main effect for flooding, in addition to being the main effect for drought. So like I said, if you don't remember anything else I said tonight, it's all about the snowpack. And now I'm going to contradict myself and say it's not 100% all about the snowpack. Because there are the models do suggest changes in precipitation, and they basically, the thing to remember there is they make it worse, they exacerbate it. So and then the other thing to remember, and the reason I don't emphasize it as much is it's both a smaller change and it's much less certain. It's a lot harder to model rain, clouds, and all of those processes than the model. And they're not fully independent, right? But it is a lot harder. But this is the stat for heavy rain events. On average, the model is saying about a 20% increase. You know, it depends a little bit where you look. There's some uncertainty around that range, but that's basically it. So still the main effect is snowpack, and that real estate effect, more rain, less snow, but this sort of makes it worse. And this is a map showing the flip side in the summer. You know, when we have less snow melt, we also, the models are suggesting, are going to have less rain. And I should say, these are both of these stats on precipitation are changes that we expect to see in the future based on the models. We have not seen a change in precipitation up to now, right? At least we haven't seen one that we can statistically. So this is all about, we think it's going to get worse in the future based on the changes in precipitation. In terms of what we've seen today, it's probably a good assumption that it's all about it. Okay, I want to then just give you a few examples that sort of, you know, because that's all well and good, right? Like there's less water in the streams, there's bigger floods. What does that actually mean for people? So I want to give some real life examples. How many of you were living here in 2015? All right, like maybe a third. Okay, so those of you that weren't, that was a really warm year. For weather nerds like me, it was like beyond what I thought was, it's just like that woman, the woman in the video, saying like it was beyond what we thought was possible. That was a marine heat wave year, like the ocean temperatures in the Eastern Pacific near us were way outside of what we thought was possible. And as a result, it's warmer than normal here. So, you know, day to day, we can have big fluctuations, right? But when you get to the annual average, those fluctuations average out. So getting big departures in the annual average is unusual, right? You need some big and this was 4 degrees Fahrenheit off the norm. So just to put that in perspective, that annual average statistic that I was showing earlier, in a century and a half, the average change is like 1.5 to 2 degrees. So double the climate change in that 1 year, right? And so it wasn't all about the temperature, that's the main story, but it was dry also, and that made it worse. But this was the year, if you've seen pictures of Snoqualmie Pass with no snow, it's from this year. There was bare dirt in January. It was incredibly low, you know, so that's the record in a lot of places, right? And so it also happens to be about how warm we expect Washington state to be in the 2070s, 2080s. I looked at the models, and like the new normal would be 2015 by about that, right? And so it's kind of like a window into the future, right? Or it could be viewed like, you know, next time one of these things happens. I think it's an opportunity both to learn and also to see what we can do and how well it works, right? Look at the effectiveness of our responses. So the starting point is just to learn. So what happens that year? Some of these are less consequential than others. It was not a good ski season. I don't think that's the most important impact, right? But some are really big, right? There was 250,000 sockeye that died, right? And that was just because there was less water. Less water heats, you know, when lower water levels, it can heat more, right? And basically the water temperatures were lethal or harmful. The major crop losses, I should just be very clear that economic estimate, there are critiques about the way they went about it, so maybe that's not exactly the right number. But, you know, big losses, right? We're not talking about, you know, we're talking about big numbers. It's a big industry in the state. And it was a big fire year. You're not guaranteed to have fires, thankfully, just because it's dry, right? And there's a lot we can do about it. But it did happen that there were big fires, and it was probably a fact, right? Okay, that's a drought example. There's another one, the flood example. How many of you were in 2021? And keep your hand up if you remember the November 2021 flood. It might have been eclipsed by the December 2025. Yeah, okay, great. So this is a picture. You cannot see Bellingham, it's on the left, but you can see Ferndale. That's the Lummi Peninsula, almost an island in this flood. This is the day after the big flood, one of the big floods that month. And you can see, of course, the rivers not in, you know, waters aren't in the river channel, right? Major flooding. Some towns were decimated, like the town of Sumas. You all might remember the water going over the border into Canada. Thousands of cattle died, drowned in the flood. Major impact, right? and actually some of those towns got flooded again this winter, right? After this one, there was a study out of BC where they looked at the likelihood of that if you hadn't had climate change up to now versus if you did, and they found that the floods made it 2 to 4 times. Full transparency, I've looked at that study, and it's not super clear if that's a snowpack change or precipitation change that's causing that. But my interpretation of that study is it is a snowpack change, and that would make sense, right? Because we haven't seen trends in the change of precipitation. Probably more in the weeds than you wanted, but just to be clear. All right, I think I need to sort of wrap up here. I want to mention just a few quick things. So I want to transition to talking about this year and next year. And before I do that, I want to just talk about, I'm going to back up and talk about how we talk about this in the hydrologic sciences, where we're talking about water availability. And what we do is we talk about the water balance, right? I mean, scientists, number geeks, we like equations. So basically we say, what are the inputs and what are the outputs? And the input is precipitation, and the outputs are things like snowpack, runoff, evaporation, right? And so if we think about like the climate, what trends and the projections in terms of that equation, you know, our input is precipitation, right? Heavier rains, drier summers, right? Less precipitation in summer. This is like a more uncertain result, right? So that's the input, right? Storage, you know, with one of the outputs, right? Snowpack is, we think of that as storage, sort of like a reservoir or a water bottle. It's like nature's water bottle, right? That one, we know it's happening fast, and it's accelerating, right? So that's like the big one. And then part of the reason I wanted to mention it in this way is to talk about this other piece I haven't mentioned, is evaporation. And a lot of what I think we think about often when we think about climate change and its effect on water is the evaporation side of the equation. And I want to mention that just to say that I don't think that's the big one, right? And that's part of why I've emphasized that. It's not the big one for 2 reasons. One, as you know, it takes a lot of energy to boil water, right? It takes a lot of energy to evaporate. And so there's only so much more you can get by making it warmer. I think it's a small factor, probably mostly on the east side. On the west side, it's probably not so much of a factor at all. And in fact, some of the models that I look at suggest we might get a little less evaporation in the future, just because humidity tracks with warming. So again, more in the weeds than you want, but if that comes up, now you know more about snowpack than about evaporation. All right, so I think I'm gonna breeze through this slide, but I just want to mention that there's different ways you can get drought, right? So now we're talking about drought. You know, you can get less in the winter, it can be less snowpack in the winter, yada yada. So that's, I think there's lots of different ways, right? And not all of them are equally affected by climate. Okay, so this year the entire state is in a declared drought, right? The Department of Ecology puts out one of these maps every year every time there's a declaration, and it happens to be that there has been one for each of the last 3 years. It's the 3rd consecutive drought. This is a lot of our snowpack. So this was what we call a snow drought. So this is a year where it's been warm. It's been above average for the last 6 months running. This is a graph you can pull up of the observations of the state of Washington, showing the range of what you typically see in past years. So the driest, lowest snowpack year in the past to the biggest snowpack year in the past. And the black line is this year. And we're in the red, which is sort of in the lower 10% or so of events, right? And so that's this year. It's totally a reflection of it being warm. You can see little storms happening. We had a little bump, and we had a rapid melt in March, things like that. And it melted out not too fast, but kept us pretty low. And so that's basically what happened this year. We had less snowpack than normal. I want to see 2 examples of what that looks like in practice. So these are if you add up all the water in all the reservoirs in Yakima, you get the blue line this year. And the average is the red line, and then the last year, which was much worse, is the green line. And the 2 things to note is they did something really smart this year. They saw it coming, and they said, we're going to fill up our reservoirs a little extra high. So we started higher than average. And it started dropping well before normal, right? Maybe almost a month or at least half a month earlier than in normal years, we started to lose reservoir level. So they're predicting that about 50% of water will be available to folks who what's called junior water users. So folks are going to have to make big cuts if they don't have the sort of oldest in time water rights. That's one practical example. there are, I'm just showing you some anecdotal examples here. There's also wildfire predictions that get put out. These are, and these are just how are the odds tilted? And I wanted to show these partly because they're across all the West. We saw a snow drought across all of the West. Some of you might have heard more about Colorado, Brian. Same story. It's warmer than normal, low snowpack. And a little bit of regional pride, by the way. The Colorado River Basin, which serves like 5 states, it has 1/6 of the water of the Columbia River. So that tells you a little bit about how hard it is to manage water across the state. Okay, so that's this year's drought. Super anecdotal, not comprehensive. I want to going a little bit long, sorry. But I wanted to just end by mentioning the El Nino. This has gotten a lot of press. I can't remember. I think super El Nino is the term that everybody is using. That is not a technical term, but you can see El Nino is characterized by warmer than normal sea surface temperatures in the Eastern Pacific off of Peru. You can see that they're happening. This actually emerged particularly early. I was actually worried that it was sort of scientific malpractice that we were talking about it so early, because you can't always predict when they happen. But this one actually emerged really early, and so I was wrong, they were right. And then I just wanted to show the predictions. People are calling it super because there is a technical definition for very strong and strong El Nino. And the models, this is the range of the models, and they range from just barely above the strong threshold to well into the very strong threshold, which is 2 degrees above normal. So we're way above normal. This would be the average, would be a la nada, is what we call it. So we are well into El Nino territory. Where we end up depends on a lot of things, right? But it seems likely we're going to have a strong El Nino. And then I can come back to these, but I was putting these up in case folks want to go to our website and look at it. But that can happen later.
Thank you so much, Guillaume. This is remarkable. Climate change has the impact already, and El Nino is adding that up, and it's definitely probabilistic. Actually, my own PhD dissertation works on the El Nino impact. So I've been following newsletters and YouTube channels on how people perceive El Nino, and I want to share a quote, a paragraph from Adrian Lambert, who's a UK-based system analyst and permaculture practitioner, and that I think this points to. I would like to read this out. El Nino is an amplifier here. The real story is ecological overshoot meeting a system with less resilience, less in reserve. Shocks travel further than they used to. Recovery takes longer. Costs stay higher after each one. Complexity keeps increasing while the returns on that complexity keep shrinking. That's the polycrisis in plain terms. Not floods arriving next Tuesday, but a harder world arriving unevenly through the ordinary channels: price, weather, food, water, energy, migration, politics, and institutional strain. So I wanted to use this quote to reflect on the fact that every component within the ecosystem and the human society is interconnected, and that resilience should embrace a holistic view. So this points to a science picture presented by Guillaume to a lived community experience and public policy that our next speakers will bring. And climate data tells us how temperatures, snowpack, and spring flows are changing. But climate impacts are not experienced as parts or regional averages. They are experienced in their neighborhoods, homes, schools, workplaces, and bodies. The same flood, heat wave, or water quality problem can have very different consequences depending on the community's exposure, health, infrastructure, political influence, and access to resources. And our second speaker will bring that essential community-centered perspective. Paulina López Bermúdez is the executive director of the Duwamish River Community Coalition. Paulina has decades of experience working at the intersections of environmental justice, civil rights, public health, equity, education, and community power. Her work emphasizes the water and climate resilience cannot be separated from housing, health, air quality, infrastructure, displacement, and the ability of residents to influence decisions affecting their lives. Tonight, she will help us understand how environmental and climate challenges are experienced in the Duwamish Valley, how communities are responding, and what equitable resilience looks like in practice. Please join me in welcoming Paulina López.
Well, thank you so much I can see you are devoted for climate and in a beautiful evening in Seattle. So thank you so much for bringing yourself today and for coming to listen to wonderful speakers. Again, my name is Paulina López, and I am a community member in the South Park area. We also call it the Duwamish Valley. Raise your hands who has been in South Park. Yay, I'd love to see that. So many people, you'll be surprised, like, where is South Park? Okay, so for that reason, I came preparing my presentation to talk a little bit more and give a little bit of perspective. And, I'm gonna take the time. What time is it? So I have like 20 minutes, right? Okay, because I can talk. So this is a map, the waterline map. I hope you're familiar with, collaborated this with the Bird Museum, but just putting in perspective how important, like our bodies of water here exist, and the Duwamish River being part and beautiful when it was back in the day, meandering and naturally, bringing so much harmony between wildlife and indigenous people and indigenous knowledge. So I like always speaking to that and bringing into, also perspective as a reminder that in 1892, the Duwamish was a peaceful home with our ancestor land of the Duwamish River, the Duwamish people. And it wasn't until 2001 when our Duwamish River was declared a Superfund site, which means it's one of the most contaminated rivers in the nation. If you haven't been on the river, I really hope you can come, and we offer usually kayak tours, boat tours. It's a beautiful way of understanding the significance on how much of vibrance it is in the river, the history, but also now how much the economy has came into our backyard in the Duwamish Valley, and to see, all those industries around. This wasn't obviously the case, and just as a reminder again, how 15 miles of the Duwamish River used to be in the natural state, and now is because of people make it straight in the 1900s just so we can serve all the economic vitality that Seattle has, and that all these industries that have come into the river to provide a lot of jobs. So that is important to mention, but also, unfortunately, some very bad neighbors came with unethical ways of doing things. So this is just another of those maps I'm going to skip. So our organization was created when the river was declared a Superfund site. And that's where we came to make sure that the voices of the people next to the river that impacted by the Superfund site are shaping the cleanup. We didn't want people to be making decisions on behalf of us, but rather the people that live there that would be. So that was the mission when we were created. We have elevated it because we believe, when we talk about water, when we talk about river, we also have to acknowledge all these other things that we do as far as environmental impact, right? So we are impacted by air pollution, by climate impact, and by all these other things that make the Duwamish Valley an environmental justice community. So we are updating this year, but this is a very important document. In 2013, we partnered up with the University of Washington, where we came up with, like all the data information to show how the cumulative health impact assessment, acknowledging that we're not only being impacted by one thing, but multiple things are the things that are making, the Duwamish Valley an environmental justice community. So we look at the 15 indicators, and also because we were interested as we are doing the cleanup of the river to see what is this going to look like when the river gets clean, and then who gets to be benefiting from this cleanup, and what is going to happen to, all this community that has been waiting for this cleanup if they are still there, because a lot of things have happened and changes have happened of displacement and gentrification. So we were studying it, and that's what brought us to the information on, all these different impacts that we have as an environmental justice community, by being in the middle of two airports, the International SeaTac Airport, the Boeing Field, as well is in our neighborhood. Superfund sites, we think it's only the one Superfund site, but actually in the Duwamish there's 4 or 5, I think, if we count all of them. The industries, we have more than 1,000 industries around us. That yes, they bring about 1 million jobs in there. But what we're finding out that those jobs are not taken by the local community, and people are, coming from Puyallup, and we've been doing an analysis, but bringing all these jobs as well, bringing extra additional traffic, freeways, and you name it, like lack of open space, etc. So in that, we realized that we are just by 10 miles, if we think about the Duwamish Valley, 10 miles from South Park and Magnolia, we have 10 years of life expectancy difference because of all these impacts already. And so this has been something that we've been bringing up, and the Washington State has been also pointing all the data that we came, which was, inspiring the city to do better, to create a Duwamish Valley program within the city to address all these impacts that they have, and realized we did the same with the Port of Seattle. And then we were pushing it together with our partners, the Front and Center, into the HEAL Act, which now acknowledges environmental justice as the law in Washington State. So I brought these as a background, and also to mention that, South Park and Georgetown have been a community of a lot of advocacy and movement. So it started with Japanese immigrants, all these farms that existed that were fueling all the vegetable fruit in Pike Place Market, with also housewives that were concerned about looking into the water being contaminated and into the contaminants. If we think about the Duwamish, with more than 42 chemicals, you can imagine everything that we have seen, and sometimes we can smell, and that we can, be concerned, even though 60% of the river has been cleaned, and right now we're in the middle of, a settlement was announced this year, reconfirming that we are on track to be cleaning it. But to give you a perspective, when I started volunteering, I started as a volunteer for the organization. We used to say it's going to take 10 years for the river to be clean, and I've been in the organization for about 15. So we consistently been saying it's been delayed. There is a lot of unfortunate ways and systemic breaks that have not allowed the progress that we would have to see. One, in the permitting process, but two, in the industries that have been there and continue to pollute the river. And we work very closely. That's why we are a coalition, the Duwamish River Community Coalition. So we have like Puget Sound Keeper, for example. We collaborate very closely with them, and keeping all these industries accountable to do what they have to do with some of the lawsuits. But really what we are seeing right now is that we want to change legislation to make significant changes and root causes changes of changing the permitting process, so they don't continue to just pay the permit and continue polluting. So I brought, because of what are we talking about today, I wanted to give you context. In 2022, what we have been saying is going to happen in 15 years already happened in 2022. And you can imagine South Park, mostly South Park on the side, because we have Georgetown and the east and the west, we have South Park. But yeah, already happened what we were scared, that the river is remembering the original shape. So that's what is happening. So we had a combination of a very high king tide together with an atmospheric river, which we were already learning through what is happening, and impacted more than 40 households in our neighborhood that were really in one morning, and December 27, it was during the holidays, and our the only one supporting them. But this is how high, some of the homes had flooding up until the waist. You didn't think about that. When I show up, one of my co-workers actually lives in the impacted neighborhood, the street, and she called me at 6:15 a.m. and she's like, we are flooded all the way. And the river was completely 2 streets down. And there was no city government to support us because everybody was on a holiday. So our organization quickly, we were mobilizing to be supporting our neighbors. We didn't see any support for about 3 days. And it was completely unexpected because nobody really realized the impact of it. So what we have been, I put this visual because it talks about, how we are obviously in an equifaction zone, and because of how we were built, and the community has been living there for a while. But if you see all these streets as when the river, when we see how we used to be, that's how the river used to be. So it was exactly mimicking how the river original shape was when the flooding happened. So I do believe that it's just trying to remember how we went before it was canalized and made it straight for these barges to pass by. So we started to now be very diligent in how we are working with our community members. We have formed an advisory board. It's called the CAD, Community Advisory. In fact, today we're having a climate event right in the street with all our impacted neighbors, because we want to design with them what would it be like to design the best options that they would have. Because this is constantly going to get only worse. Since 2022, the city, we've been pushing them to do some protection of the neighborhoods during the king tide season. So right now, everything has been a very temporary barricade of sandbags, which we are thinking is how, a protected levee, or what is it that we want to see. We didn't want to assume that we want to build, obviously, a wall or a levee just to protect us, but rather, after all the work that we've been doing to bring the habitat back, to bring our harmony again with the river, cleaning it up and healing it. So this is the temporary wall as it looks. If you come to South Park, you would see, and you can imagine also that is a very expensive, a way to respond, but it's a flood barrier that we're trying to pretty much protect in every king tide season, which will start at the end of October again. So every year we'll be seeing how much the river is coming higher and higher, up to 14 inches above the usual. So this is what helps it. But most importantly, what we would like to do with, in collaboration with the government, with our community, in designing what would be the best flooding adaptation and mitigation of that will represent our neighborhood in the best way. So far, we partnered with the University of Washington because we wanted to hear what our options are according to the reality that we have in the community. And majority of the people have said, what we want to see is a great example. I don't know if you've been at People's Park, but this used to be a very contaminated area. It was called Terminal 117, and which used to be an old asphalt company. This was one of the earlier action areas, which probably Chris worked very hard to. And if it wasn't for the voice of community, we would have had here a parking lot. This is what was suggested by the Port of Seattle. So DRCC put together a lot of the neighbors, just like you. We call into meetings, we put them on the buses to be speaking about the benefits of bringing a habitat and bringing a park to community that was already impacted, not having enough open spaces. So it's been an amazing asset. This was the plan before, is how it was. And if you see there now, it's covered in beautiful, mesh and native plants that are representing some of the land back and the healing, all the spaces that we have. So it's one of the great wins that we bring, but actually also uplifting the voices of one community gets to be heard by government. We know what is good for us. So the community has been saying, what would it take if on all the places that we're seeing the flooding, that we would be bringing more nature-based solutions as a way of getting us protected. So just last year, I think we brought an additional 20,000. Dana, do you remember the amount of fish that came back this past year? It was about 20,000 more salmon that we usually have been. And it's past season for fishing because the river provides for a lot of families, either for subsistence or for cultural reasons, a lot of fishing happening on the river. So this past year season, we saw the highest I've seen of coho salmon. And so we work very closely, and that's what we want. We want the habitat to come back and to remember how this beautiful river used to be the provider of so much, and before it got abused by so many bad practices. So this is a little bit of how we look right when it looks now different because all the native plants have been growing. There was a video in there, but maybe it's not working. So yeah. You can see there how it's now containing the water because now it's even more because all these native plants are actually planted by our local youth, also bringing that ownership. We will like this is how when it's high tide, that match gets a perfect indication of a nature restoration that is working, and we see how much community and habitat, and it was in community perspective. Now the Port of Seattle is getting awards and everything, and how wonderful they are. I'm always commenting on their LinkedIn. So yeah, I just wanted to say the importance, and I cannot emphasize for whatever changes we're doing in communities, and that's what always has been. Nothing about us without us is what we always emphasize. If it's something that a change is going to come, the community has to be centered and the voices to be heard, because we know we are in the middle of the community. I've been in the neighborhood for more than 24 years now, and I know what I smell, I know what I see, I know what I hear my neighbors. So that's the environmental justice principle number one. So it was just how we do. There it is. How do we get to do all our work? This is a beautiful picture. We have a youth program, the Duwamish Valley Youth Force, and we don't do anything unless we include our local youth. We have the highest percentage of youth of color in South Park, so it's very important for us that they get to be involved in every single climate conversation that we have, because whatever we're doing is going to impact them and their next generation, and that's what we have to think as we are thinking of protection. So I'm going to stop right there. I just wanted to say that I hope you can get connected. Yesterday in our event that we hosted in the community, another climate event, somebody asked me what is the best way to be connected, and I say, sometimes it's very hard for a community to participate in public forums, to participate in hearings. Many immigrant communities, of course, right now, because of the fear they have to be going around, it's hard to participate. But we have you. We have the whole supporters and believers of environmental healing, of environmental anti-racism, and I hope you can join our cause. We have our a very active social media, DRCC.org, and we post all our events about the cleanup. And so I have a flyer there about our Duwamish River Festival, which is coming on August 8th. It's a great way to come and support and to hear more from neighbors, to hear more about what is happening and how we need the collective to be able to make all the significant changes for climate justice and to bring finally health equity into the Duwamish Valley. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Paulina. Let's come to the Duwamish River Festival and enjoy together. So, Guillaume helped us understand the underlying physical processes of the heat, drought, and low snowpack, and why the timing, form, and location and precipitation matter just as much as the annual total. And so, Paulina has reminded us that the consequences of this climate and water stress are not determined by physical causes alone. They are also shaped by the history, inequality, access to resources, and whose knowledge is included in decision-making process. Resilience cannot be measured only by infrastructure or technical performance. It must also be measured by whether communities are healthy, protected, heard, and able to shape their own futures. And so the next question is, what can our laws, institutions, and civic systems do about it? Chris Wilke is the executive director for the Center for Environmental Law and Policy, or CELP, and my co-host for tonight's event. CELP works to protect, preserve, and restore Washington's water through advocacy, public education, policy reform, and public interest law. Chris has extensive experience working on water quality, freshwater protection, environmental policy, and civic advocacy at the local, state, national, and international level. Tonight, he will discuss the policy implications of the challenges we have heard about, emerging opportunities for action, and ways individuals and organizations can support long-term water security and climate resilience throughout the Pacific Northwest. Please join me in welcoming Chris Wilke.
Okay, so I took another presentation and condensed it down. So pardon me if I go quickly through a few slides here. So he's already introduced me, but born and raised in the area here. I'm a water nerd. I fish for all 8 species of salmon and trout that are in our area. And I've seen all, how many species of marine mammals do we have here? Does anyone want to guess? I've seen all 10 of them. So between the porpoise and the baleen whales and the orca whales and the seals and sea lions. So, and I've even got a nose for it. I smelled a humpback whale one time before I saw it. And you know how I know I smelled it? The next day I smelled the same smell, and then there was the whale again. It was a beautiful smell. And there's me in my happy place at the middle fork of the Snoqualmie River, and we skewed the rainbow just to that picture. So, Jackie's already read our mission. We are the Center for Environmental Law and Policy. And I'm going to go real quickly through the first part, which I cut way back, but I wanted to make sure we talked about salmon. Salmon aren't the only measure of environmental quality, but they touch just about everything. And if we protect salmon, we will protect ourselves. So as an indicator, if we focus on salmon, it will provide multiple benefits. And since we're talking about climate, I thought I would give a Bill Clinton quote. I actually heard him say this at a Waterkeeper conference, and he kind of messed up the metaphor, but I'm quoting him word for word here. He says, if you're working for water protection and not including climate, you may win the war, but you'll lose the battle. You got that backwards? That is a quote. So our rivers and salmon, there's an unbroken chain of water molecules from the top of Mount Rainier to the Pacific Ocean. And salmon are the link that swim up those rivers. They spawn in their native streams where they were born. They leave as tiny little animals, and they go out to the ocean and they get big, and they come back and they nourish the forest. 60% of the organic carbon in a mature Douglas fir tree is derived from the ocean, and it arrives there because of salmon. So we have to protect them. And as we've already covered, these higher summer stream temperatures, lower water flows, those are very impactful for salmon. They, somewhere around, I'll get the number wrong, probably around 68 or 70 degrees Fahrenheit, salmon get incredibly stressed and start to die. The different species can tolerate some different temperatures, but it is lethal to salmon when the water gets low and warm. Climate change isn't the only thing that's impacting them. They were already having a hard time because of our development, the pollution that we have here. Giving a shout out to Puget Soundkeeper, where I worked for 17 years. In the higher dust, you've probably heard about that, the 6-PBDQ chemical, which targets the coho salmon in particular, killing before they spawn. They were already facing all these pressures, and now we're going to add on those impacts of climate change on top of that. And of course, as I mentioned, the food web is the salmon are the link from the orca whales. That pictures I took on January 1st, 2025. there. And then here you have a chum salmon swimming up a creek in Seattle to spawn on Piper Creek. We've already seen these drought maps. So in 2023, a drought was declared with nearly a statewide drought. In 2024, we got a more sparse drought in 2025, but it was very severe in the areas. So it was actually incredibly severe in the Yakima and Kittitas counties. And then again, these are the reservoir levels in October of last year. 4%, 16%, 4%. And people got their water rights curtailed. They have this seniority system, and they were curtailing water rights all the way back to 1865. So that means anyone whose water rights were after 1865 were getting curtailed in October of last year. And it was only because of an adjudication process for 40 years that the Yakima tribe had their water rights back to time immemorial, and those were the 1865 rights that were protected. So that's the law, the system that we don't love, but sometimes you can get a good result out of that. The Yakima River is the most upside down water system in the state. It is almost entirely artificial in the way the flows are managed there. And then here we are in 2026, and we have a statewide drought. I also want to talk about water quality. This is a kind of a fuzzy screenshot of a map on Department of Ecology's website. It's, I see someone smiling, you know, about the 303 C list. Wow, okay, we've got good water nurses now. So this is an assessment that's done on our waterways, is required by the Clean Water Act, and data are reported up to the state, and then they publish this report and they send it to the federal government. And red and purple are not good colors in this. The green is the good color, and the red and the purple mean it's not meeting water quality standards. So categories 4 and 5, meaning it is failing standards for at least one parameter. And who knows what the leading pollutants in the state of Washington is, impacting more waterways than anything else. Temperature, there we go. You can have a chocolate chip cookie over there. Temperature is the #1 pollutant in Washington state water. It's in flow impacts temperature, water level impacts temperature, the air temperature impacts water temperature, and the amount of habitat along the sides of the stream, and other factors too. Groundwater impacts temperature. And we already talked about how that's lethal to salmon. So there's different strategies that we can use to protect river flows. We can reduce new appropriations. Once we get fully appropriated a water basin, we need to stop giving out new water rights. We can limit wells that go in. We can look at the water withdrawal permits. We can also look at things like hydropower and other dams. A lot of people think that a dam is a solution to hold water back so you can use it later. And it may create a timing buffer for you, but it actually causes a loss of water because you get more evaporation and that sort of thing, and it can impact the groundwater. And of course, they're really bad for the fish that we're trying to protect also. So adaptation and resilience are key strategies. We know climate change is getting worse. We've already heard about that. It is going to impact our salmon. It's going to impact our communities. So the things that we can do now to improve the habitat, to improve community resilience, will pay dividends when we get in coming decades with climate change. And we also have to talk about mitigation of climate change. We could choose to burn less carbon as a community or as an individual. As a state, Washington State is a leader in climate policy and carbon policy, but we can't do this alone. If our state reduces its carbon footprint to 0, we're still going to be impacted by climate change because we are 0.1% of the global population. 8.1 million people in Washington and 8.1 billion people in the world. So I think I have that number right. So we have to deal with fossil fuels. We can't adapt our way out of this crisis. It will keep getting worse, and we will adapt, and it will keep getting worse, and we'll adapt. We're always going to be playing catch up. So we have to deal with the root causes of climate change. There are some exciting things happening. There's a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty you can get involved in. There's one city in Washington State that has endorsed it, the Yakima. for endorsing the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, something maybe that the city of Seattle could do. There's an insurance network that is working on rewarding companies that don't insure fossil fuels, called Insure Our Future. And there was a conference this April, the first international conference on the transition away from fossil fuels in Santa Marta, Colombia. So there's a lot of things that we might hear about internationally, different numbers. Why should we care about the global climate and Pacific Northwest? It's because we are part of the global climate, and we're going to have to solve that problem. Here's something to think about on that. If all of humanity reduced our carbon usage by 50%, which we are not on track to do, we're not anywhere close to doing, would temperatures continue to rise? Would they stay about the same, more or less around 1.5? Depending which method you use, would drop slightly? Or would there be like a coming ice age and we'd all freeze and die? Temperature's still going to go up. If we cut our carbon emissions in half, it's still going to go up. We need to get down to nearly zero. So that's a big job. And we have to, when they say net zero by 2050 or all that stuff, say within 1.5, that's if you get to work immediately. If you wait until 2048, you already passed the deadline like a decade ago. So we have to get to work right away. I'm going to keep moving, but there's different things you can do that are local pressures, local actions, global pressures, global actions. Thinking also about the fossil fuels and the root causes of the climate crisis. Lots of impacts on water. I'm going to try and keep going here because I want to leave time for questions. I do want to say a little bit about hydropower. It's often thought of as renewable energy. Sometimes people say renewable energy like wind, solar, and hydropower. When they show you how great renewable energy is doing, a lot of times they like to lump in hydropower. They want you to feel like we're making progress. And hydropower is not clean energy. It is not green energy. It blocks fish passage, it ruins fisheries, and it destroys communities. And what else? Methane. So there's a dam building boom going around the world right now. They're damming the Amazon, they're damming the Mekong, they're damming the Congo, and we're pretty dammed already. A new hydropower reservoir can emit the carbon dioxide equivalent of a coal-fired power plant in the first 20 years. So if you think you're getting green energy from a dam, you think good. John Harrison with Washington State University has a report that we've been underestimating the carbon emissions from hydropower reservoirs. So we need to think about that. We can actually remove dams as a form of climate adaptation and also bolster our fish runs at the same time. So reasons for hope. I don't know if I love the term hope. I prefer agency to hope, but I guess that's the reason for hope is that we have agency. And there's been some progress on renewable energy, and nations are beginning to take a stand. Public opinion is shifting, particularly outside the U.S., so we have some work to do in the United States. But don't succumb to the climate talking. Keep talking about climate in conversations. We need to keep these issues on the forefront. Okay, this is part two, so I'm going to go really fast. But I did want to let you know a little bit about some specific things with water policy. So in-stream flows is a term that refers to the amount of water that is passing down a stream, and they can be adjudicated or asserted as a water right. So the river can have a water right. The Nooksack River has a water right going back to 1985. So any water rights after 1985 can only be exercised if the Nooksack River has enough water. But if the water level's below that, there's no guarantee that it's going to get its water. So we do have impaired flows due to overconsumption, precipitation patterns. There's going to be less seasonal water available as we move forward. And then this also has impacts on groundwater recharge and creates habitat loss and those kind of things. A little bit about Western water law. There's a concept called first-in-time, first-in-right, prior appropriation doctrine. It basically means whose grandpa or grandma got here first gets the water. And it's not that way so much in the eastern U.S., but it is throughout the West. And when you have a water right, if you've been using it, it's called beneficial use, by the way. But if you've been using it, that is your right. And it doesn't matter if the river has enough water, if you have that right to take that water. So we do need to look at that long term, but we can look at in-stream flows, and we can go through a process called adjudication, which basically determines how much those rights should actually be and whether or not it's been used. It's determined by a court. It's not determined by state policy. I'm going to skip ahead. We talked a little bit about this, not a guarantee, but it does establish rights. There's a couple of major decisions. There's the Foster decision and the Hearst decision, which have implications for how well permits can go in. And unfortunately, with the Hearst decision was, which really affirmed there must actually be water available before you can develop the land that takes the water. The legislature moved for a Stream Flow Restoration Act a couple years later, and it basically said, if we do watershed planning and mitigation and restoration projects, we can go ahead and build some more wells. So it's kind of a Band-Aid and going to put further pressure on our rivers. So Supreme Court decisions have strengthened this protection, but only somewhat, and there are some workarounds. So we have to keep a good look on it. This is the slide that I really wanted to show you because these are some big opportunities for the next couple of years. There's a state waters alteration permit process. It's going to be rulemaking this fall around that. So this is around protecting wetlands. There's a state initiative, the Washington's Water Future. There's a public meeting in August, on August 4th, that you can attend. Contact us if you want to get involved. Potential for legislation or maybe not. So they really are wanting to hear from people about these water issues. Your community's local adaptation planning, those are things you can get involved in. The Nooksack River is going through this adjudication process. That's ongoing right now. And we need to also be looking at data centers. Amazon and Microsoft are two names that people really know, and they both have net zero pledges. Microsoft, I read their carbon footprint went up 25% last year. And Amazon went up 16%. So they're not quite tracking on their net zero pledges. Federal shenanigans, reducing the coverage of the Clean Water Act, all kinds of stuff like that. Anything you can do for habitat and water quality is good. And of course, dam level and dam removal and blocking new dams. So this is it for me. I wanted to give a shout out to DRCC, get involved with them. Puget Sound Keeper, who's here tonight, get involved with them. They have volunteer projects. And here we are at KELP, and there's my email if you want to get involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. So yes, all the perspectives are so important. And a little add for myself, I've been developing some ideas over water conservation cross-sectoral, especially for data center operators, community coalitions, and the decision makers. They need to be on the same page. We need to provide scientific data so that people can be on the same table discussing the topic. So, and I would like to, we've gone through science, community, and policy aspects. So I'd like to invite Guillaume, Paulina, and Chris. Thank you for your presentation.